In 1755, the British government rounded up thousands of Acadians in Nova Scotia and shipped them off to other British colonies in North America, many of them to Louisiana. There was no compensation and no mercy. The ones who arrived in Louisiana evolved from Acadians to Cajuns, but many others died on the journey. Now, a Louisiana lawyer thinks it is time the British government apologized. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana this morning, Cajun lawyer Warren Perrin. Good morning.
Good morning.
Canadian school children are taught, Mr. Perrin, or used to be, that the Acadians were deported, but not much more than that. Tell me what it was like for the Acadians.
The Acadians had established a culture after leaving France in the early 17th century, and they developed the idea of liberty. And this idea of liberty was their greatest asset, and yet at the same time, some historians say they're undoing, and they're failing to yield to their oath of fidelity to their family and to the government of Britain, which they had taken in 1730, and eventually led to their deportation when they failed to yield to the British demands that they take an unconditional oath of allegiance.
Who was Charles Lawrence?
Charles Lawrence was the lieutenant governor who actually had no authority to order the deportation, but it was through his efforts. He's been described as a paranoid, militaristic leader whose real motives we've never understood. But he didn't have this authority, but he carried out the deportation in the name of the Crown, and therefore, under the legal doctrine of respondeat superior, the Crown would be legally responsible for the deportation.
The deportation itself was brutal. People died on the voyage. Tell me about that.
I found it interesting that a recent opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. States that 1/3 of the Jewish population were exterminated. Likewise, 1/3 of the Acadian people were exterminated in their genocide. Whether it was all deliberate or accidental, we don't particularly think is relevant. The fact is the deportation was a clear effort at ethnic cleansing to rid that part of the world, Nova Scotia, of the Acadian people, and I'm happy to say that it failed, that we as Acadian people have a resurgence in our pride as we will be celebrating the second Congrès Mondial Acadien in 1999 here in Louisiana.
How did these thousands of people die?
Probably because of poor preparation. They used ships that had been designed to carry cattle rather than people. Some of the ships was sunk at sea, but literally the Acadians had a bounty on their head, as did the Mi'kmaq people. And so they were hunted as animals during the 7 years of the 7 Years' War between France and England.
Do you think there is a kind of community memory of all this among Cajuns even all these years later?
No question. In order to justify the deportation, Lawrence and his gang had to label the Acadian people as international criminals. We know that they were in fact neutrals, but what they had to do was totally ignore all the British laws, civil and international at that time, which prohibited the deportation of any British subject without an act of Parliament. Ignoring those laws made the deportation illegal. And what I find particularly offensive is that in the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1763, ending the war, the order of deportation, or the edict, was continued in effect, and I believe it continues in effect today, and that's what I seek to annul.
But Cajuns now living in Louisiana centuries later, you think are still somehow affected by this?
This is what motivated me when I told the story of my ancestors to my 9-year-old child, and he asked me the question, "Dad, does this mean that our ancestors were international criminals?" The answer is yes, and as I am a descendant of those people, and if in fact the edict of deportation is still in effect, does that not make me also an international criminal?
What do you want
from
What do you want from the British government now, Mr. Perrin?
Essentially, we seek no money. That has to be made very clear. This is a symbolic gesture. We seek, number one, an admission of the wrong, the admission of the illegality. Number two, we seek an annulment of the order, an expulsion from the edict of the deportation. And thirdly, a reconciliation with the British government and the Crown that this should never happen again, and a monument, some type of symbolic monument to make sure that future generations are aware of the lessons of this terrible historical event.
The British are saying, almost under their breaths, I guess, look, it's been 243 years. This is almost quaint now. Why not let bygones be bygones?
Longfellow, in his famous poem Evangeline, stated, and I quote, "The exile begins never to end." It's never too late to right a wrong. We know that the British sought an apology for the mistreatment of their soldiers by the Japanese, which occurred 50 years ago. We know the British have apologized to the Maori people of New Zealand for taking their country, which occurred 160 years ago. We also know that Prime Minister of England recently expressed regret for the government's involvement in the Irish potato famine, which occurred 180 years ago. So if we're going to go back 180 years, why not go back 240 years and rectify the wrong of the Acadian deportation?
Mr. Perrin, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
In 1604, French settlers began landing in Canada in what is now Nova Scotia. Then it was called Acadia, hence the French Acadians. But when the British took over Canada, they found the arrangement with the French intolerable. So finally, in 1755, with brute force, the British forced the Acadians to ship out. Those who didn't go home to France drifted southward to what is now South Louisiana. 1/3 died.
They retained attorneys in Houston.
Now come forward 243 years. Warren Perrin of Lafayette, of Acadian descent, is still hot about this, not necessarily just because of the injustice, but because the French Acadians and their descendants, which is just about everybody here who's Cajun, are still listed by the British government as criminals.
What really enraged me was when I learned that the order of exile is still in effect today in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. It had to be continued in effect to prevent those Acadians, my ancestors, from returning to their lands.
So Warren Perrin, a lawyer by trade, has filed a lawsuit against the Queen of England, not for money, not for damages, but just for apology and restoration.
The Acadians are still prohibited by the Edict of Deportation from returning to Nova Scotia. That's what we're going to change.
No word yet from the Queen. Leo Honeycutt, Channel 2 News.